My neighbour, a perpetually cheerful retired clown named Patches, decided our quiet suburban street desperately needed more whimsy. His grand solution was to stealthily replace everyone's beloved garden gnomes with terrifying life-sized porcelain clown statues in the dead of night. Waking up to a leering 6-foot-tall clown with a rusty tricycle on your lawn is an experience I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It took 3 chaotic neighbourhood meetings, a formal petition, and a restraining order to finally get him to cease his midnight decorating sprees. The gentleman next door, a man in his late 40s named Gary, was fully convinced that lawn goblins were plotting to destroy his prize-winning petunias. His only defence, he claimed, was to mow his lawn while wearing a full, clanking suit of medieval armour. Every Saturday morning we'd watch him struggle with the push-mower, his helmet plume bobbing with effort. He would frequently stop to brandish his rake at passing cars, challenging the drivers to a formal joust. Things escalated when he started digging a moat along the property line, which is when we finally called the city. My old upstairs neighbour genuinely believed he was a werewolf. It wasn't just a quirky personality trait, he was deeply committed to the idea. Every single full moon, without fail, our apartment complex would be filled with his loud, mournful howling from his balcony. One summer night, my beagle, Bartholomew, decided to howl back. Hearing this, the neighbour sprinted to our shared fence and began a frantic, whispered monologue, trying to initiate my very confused dog into his pack. It was a bizarre mix of hilarious and genuinely concerning behaviour. The woman who lived in the apartment below me was a self-proclaimed cat psychic, and she took her job very seriously. She claimed she could communicate with the spirits of deceased felines. I once came home late from work to find a full-blown séance happening on her patio. There was a circle of flickering candles, and about 15 cats from around the neighbourhood were sitting in a silent, perfect circle around her as she chanted what sounded like gibberish. It was an eerie, strangely organised gathering that I never forgot. My neighbour decided to become an entrepreneur by starting a worm farm in his apartment's only bathtub. He was convinced he was on the verge of revolutionising the fishing bait industry. The earthy, damp smell that began to seep through the vents was indescribable and utterly nauseating. The entire venture came to a spectacular and disgusting end when he forgot the water running, and the tub overflowed, sending a muddy river of thousands of wiggling worms directly into my apartment below. My landlord was not amused. I had a reclusive neighbour who would only communicate through notes attached to a hefty brick, which he would then unceremoniously throw onto your front porch. The notes were always for the most mundane requests, like asking to borrow a cup of flour or inquiring about the weather. I tried repeatedly to give him my phone number or just talk to him face to face, but he insisted his brick mail was a more secure and reliable form of communication. My porch steps were permanently chipped from his deliveries. A guy down the street was completely obsessed with pirates. His passion project was building a small, non-functional but surprisingly detailed pirate ship in his driveway, which he named the Salty Serpent. Every weekend, he would don a full pirate captain's costume, complete with a tri-corner hat and a fake parrot on his shoulder, and sit on the ship's deck drinking rum from a bottle. He'd shout, "Ahoy, matey!" and other pirate jargon at anyone who dared to walk past his house. The novelty wore off very quickly. My next-door neighbour was a sweet, eccentric old lady who had a pet squirrel she named General Fluffytail. She treated this squirrel like a human child, dressing him in tiny, custom-made outfits that matched her own and pushing him around the neighbourhood in a vintage doll stroller. The problem was that General Fluffytail was a vicious, ungrateful little beast who would leap from his stroller and attack anyone who got too close, hissing and chittering with pure rage. The family across the street decided to hold a solemn Viking funeral for their pet goldfish, Bubbles. This elaborate ceremony involved constructing a small wooden pyre in their backyard and placing the deceased goldfish inside a tiny flammable toy boat on top. They then lit the pyre. The fire department had to be called when the flames grew unexpectedly large, catching the low-hanging branches of their massive oak tree on fire. It was a surprisingly dramatic farewell for a goldfish. My neighbour was an aspiring and wildly unsuccessful inventor. His latest contraption was a personal flight device he'd cobbled together from two powerful leaf blowers duct taped to an old skateboard. I watched in horrified fascination from my window as he strapped this death trap to his feet. With a triumphant yell, he revved up the engines and was immediately launched backward at an incredible speed, crashing violently into his own fence. He miraculously escaped injury, but the fence was completely destroyed. A woman in my building was utterly convinced that pigeons were robotic government drones sent to spy on citizens. She spent her days on her balcony, her head protected by a carefully crafted tin foil hat, trying to jam their surveillance signals with a cacophony of dozens of wind chimes. She also kept a large, brightly coloured water gun on her patio table, which she would use to deactivate any pigeon that dared to land on her railing. Her dedication was almost admirable. My neighbour decided to turn his entire front yard into a giant playable chessboard. He spent months carving the massive pieces himself out of tree stumps he'd salvaged. Once it was complete, he would stand on his porch with a megaphone every afternoon and attempt to challenge random passers-by to a game, offering eternal glory and neighbourhood bragging rights as the grand prize. Most people just awkwardly picked up their pace and crossed to the other side of the street. I used to live next to a professional competitive eater who took his training very seriously. His backyard became his training ground. I once witnessed him attempting to eat 50 hot dogs, buns and all, in under 10 minutes, while his wife timed him with a stopwatch and their two young children cheered him on like it was the Olympics. The sounds he made were truly unforgettable, and not in a good way. He never did beat the world record. The man who lived in the apartment directly above me was a professional mime, and apparently his art form was not as silent as one would think. He would practice his craft at all hours, and the constant thudding and scraping noises were maddening. I would be jolted awake at 3 a.m. by the sound of him vigorously climbing a rope or being trapped in a box directly over my bed. The landlord received numerous complaints about the surprisingly loud, silent artist. My neighbour was a massive fan of the movie Jurassic Park and lived in a constant state of fear of a velociraptor attack, despite living in suburban Ohio. He spent an entire summer and a small fortune constructing a raptor-proof fence around his property. It was a terrifying monstrosity of chain link, barbed wire, and low-voltage electric wiring. He didn't own any pets or have any children. He just wanted to be fully prepared for the inevitable dinosaur apocalypse. A woman down the street fancied herself an opera singer. Her practice sessions were a daily neighbourhood-wide event, as she would open every window in her house and belt out arias at the top of her lungs. Unfortunately, her voice sounded less like a classically trained soprano and more like a distressed cat being put through a garbage disposal. Thanks to her, the entire neighbourhood unwillingly learned every single word to every song from The Phantom of the Opera. My neighbour decided to start a free-range organic chicken farm in his tiny suburban backyard. He started with a few hens, but it quickly ballooned to about 50 chickens that were constantly escaping and running amok. They terrorized the neighborhood, roosting on people's cars, digging up prize-winning rose bushes for worms, and leaving their droppings on every available surface. It felt less like a quaint farm, and more like a scene from Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. I had a neighbour who was a very vocal and dedicated conspiracy theorist who firmly believed the world was flat. He would spend his weekends in his backyard, attempting to launch large weather balloons with cheap cameras taped to them to gather evidence and expose the globalist lies. Inevitably, every single balloon would either get tangled in the power lines or drift a few hundred feet before crash landing in someone else's swimming pool. He never got his proof. The guy living next door was a performance artist, and the neighborhood was his unwilling audience. His latest masterpiece involved him sitting perfectly still and silent in a large inflatable kiddie pool filled to the brim with tomato juice in his front yard. He stayed there for 12 hours straight, from sunrise to sunset, staring blankly ahead. He posted a sign next to the pool that simply read, "The Womb of Regret." We all just tried to avoid that side of the street. My neighbour was absolutely certain that he had a portal to another dimension located in his hall closet. He would often have very loud, animated, and entirely one-sided conversations with the sentient beings he claimed resided on the other side. One afternoon, he knocked on my door and very seriously asked if I could spare a cup of sugar for his interdimensional guests, explaining that their realm lacked affordable sweeteners. I politely but firmly declined. A family on my street was obsessed with Christmas and decided to celebrate it twice a year with a massive Christmas in July party. They would drag out all of their decorations, including a massive sun-faded inflatable Santa, and cover their house in blinking lights. For an entire weekend, in the sweltering 95-degree heat, they would blast Christmas carols from outdoor speakers. It was a surreal and deeply confusing experience for everyone involved. My neighbour was an amateur beekeeper, which was a charming hobby until the day his queen bee decided to relocate. I came home from work to find a massive, buzzing, pulsating cloud of thousands of bees had attached itself to my front door, completely blocking the entrance. The beekeeper's brilliant solution was to stand a safe distance away and try to lure them back by singing Bee Gees songs to them. It was surprisingly ineffective, and we had to call a professional. I had a neighbour who earnestly believed he was a powerful wizard. He was fully committed to the persona, walking around the neighbourhood daily in a long velvet robe, a pointy hat adorned with cheap plastic stars, and carrying a gnarled wooden staff. He once approached me while I was washing my car and offered to cast a spell of vehicular protection on it for the low price of $20. I told him I'd take my chances with my car insurance. The woman who lived across the street from me was a hoarder, but she had a very specific and peculiar obsession: garden gnomes. Her entire front yard was an overwhelming, densely packed sea of hundreds, if not thousands of them. There were gnomes fishing in a dry bird bath, gnomes having a meeting on her porch, and gnomes peeking out from every bush. It was a bizarre, slightly creepy, and undeniably impressive display of dedication to a single theme. My neighbour decided to build a backyard roller coaster for his kids using scrap wood, old pipes, and a shocking amount of duct tape. The resulting structure was a rickety, unsafe-looking monstrosity that creaked ominously in the wind. My concern turned to genuine alarm when I saw him attempting a test run by placing the family's beagle in the makeshift cart and giving it a push. I called Child and Animal Protective Services immediately after that. A young man in my apartment building was an aspiring DJ who seemed to think that 3 a.m. was the optimal time to practice his craft. He would crank the bass up so high that the pictures on my walls would vibrate and my floor would hum. When a group of us went to complain, he opened the door and, with a completely straight face, told us that he couldn't control when inspiration struck and that he was just chasing the dream. The landlord helped him chase it elsewhere,